Welcome back, Curious Hearts. I'm Vera. Together, in every episode, we get to explore what it is we really believe, how we practice, and we get to meet people who are on their own spiritual path. Together, we begin. Welcome back, y'all. This is episode 20 of Curious Hearts, and I'm just so delighted that you're here with me and that we've made it this far together. Today's episode is maybe the most philosophically challenging. It's maybe the headiest episode. And it's also, for me, been one of the most important anchors, one of the most important spiritual principles that brings me back to being in real, deep connection with something that's bigger than me. Today, we're talking about paradox. And if you probably look at any spiritual other text or, religious traditions, I don't know that anybody would necessarily name this as a core spiritual principle. And yet I think it's essential for us to really engage in a spiritual life and in a spiritual practice. At least it has been for me. So let's start with really simple, which is like, what's the definition of paradox? Paradox is when two opposite things that appear contradictory must be true at the same time. And usually it's used in like logic puzzles or philosophy, and sometimes in like really advanced mathematics. That's not exactly where I'm going, but if you have a background in any of those things, it might be an interesting exploration for you. What makes paradox essential to spiritual life is that it doesn't make rational sense. No paradox makes rational sense. I found a quote as I was preparing for this episode that I want to share with you, and it's taken from a review of a book about Madeleine L'Engle. And the quote is from a writer named Laura London. Fiction feels truer the more I read it, and nonfiction feels like confident guessing. Fiction feels truer the more I read it, and nonfiction feels like confident guessing. Part of what paradox does is it reveals how limited language is, and that the agreed upon definitions of what certain words mean actually don't contain the fullness of what that thing or that idea truly is. That, for nonfiction to feel kind of like a guess and like it isn't entirely sure, and for fiction to feel true and sure, is maybe an experience you have in your bones, right? There's something about, movies or novels that feel like they're telling something true about us, truer sometimes than an autobiography or a biography, or certainly than a nonfiction instruction text. That is an example, right, of something paradoxical, right? That in itself, it is self-referencing, right? It refers to itself, and in that self-reference, it denies itself, it negates itself, right? The oldest paradox that we know is this sentence is false, right? That's the most like common, boring, everyday notion of a logical paradox. This sentence is false, like does not compute in a logical sense, because if the sentence is false, then it's true, but it's right. You got it. You figured it out. There's a whole genre of art that's created about this, like ceci ne pas en pipe, right? Those sorts of things that you're just like, wait, what? It doesn't work in our brains, right? MC Escher drawings that they defy our experience of reality. You probably can see where I'm going with this. I believe that paradox is not just an invitation, an entry point into a spiritual awareness, but it is also an essential quality of any spiritual life. And it is, it comes to life inside of spiritual practices, and that the most nourishing spiritual practices are the ones that allow us to tap into the paradoxical nature of being. So I'll share with you my personal example of this. And I'm sure that there are other stories. There are actually other examples from the interviews that we've had so far. The very first interview I did with Becca Rich about time and the nature of time, and that in order to really find a deep relationship with time, we had to release time, right? It's like those two things don't actually make sense logically, but there is a place in our spirit that understands it, and a place beyond words. For me, my work is tremendously paradoxical. When, so, 13 or 14 years ago, I became a yoga teacher, and I was teaching yoga and I loved it. And in many ways, I felt this inner call to the joy of teaching, and also knew it was not logically practical for me to leave my professional life to become a full-time yoga teacher. I could have been a starving artist in my 20s, but, at 33 with a mortgage and a dog and a new car I had just bought was like not the right choice. So as I was going on my own journey of trying to figure out what came next, my best friend asked me to officiate her wedding, which set off a whole domino effect to me of wanting to be a spiritual pastor. I was like, wait, there is actually a profession of people who do this stuff. There are people who give what we call in yoga a dharma talk. They give a dharma talk once a week, aka a sermon. They officiate ceremonies, and they nurture a congregation of people. Like, I want to do that. How can I be a spiritual pastor? And the more I have explored this work, the inherent paradox of it is not lost on me. That what is true is that the largest growing segment of the population, at least in the United States, according to the Pew Research poll, is those folks who are spiritual but not religious. It means that they feel that they're connected to something bigger themselves. They maybe understand or believe there is this deeper meaning in life, but they don't ascribe to one belief, structure or not. They have maybe divested from churches because institutions are complicated, or maybe they just don't feel called to any church. And you may or may not be one of those people. I know I certainly am. Even though I love going to church, I never feel like I quite belong in any one of them. Or it feels too hard to be exclusive with any of them. But what does that mean for me? Like, to be a pastor, you need a church. And I feel inherently drawn to spiritual service for people who don't want to join a church. So you might just say, and I say to myself that I've just built a house of cards, right? This is like a setup to fail. But I don't actually think that's true. I think that the deep spiritual needs that exist in us as humans to ask really big questions and be in the uncertainty and the curiosity, to reckon with the paradox of being human in the world, and our deep need to be in community with other people who are doing that and who are on this path together and cultivating that sense of community. I think that those are innate. I think that is an innate human need, and we have recreated things that might meet those needs in other areas. But that is the thing that I feel called to work with and to acknowledge, and to sort of set a table for people to show up and to acknowledge that need within themselves and find their own way to have that need be met. But it means that I am a pastor without a church forever. I don't actually think it's possible. I think that I will continue to officiate ceremony. I think I will continue to have these kinds of conversations. And that is my hope. It's my dream that that continues to happen. And yet, I also don't want to start a church. So like there is this to both be a thing and not be it at the same time has been an essential reckoning for me. It has made explaining my work and my, where I sit in the world harder for other people. But also the fact that it is hard to put a container around, the fact that it doesn't fit in a box is one of the ways that I know it is right for me. And so I want to explore this idea of paradox with you today, because I think you probably have your own experience of paradox. And when we can tap into that sense of like the inherent conflict in something where it can still be itself and contradict itself, and where the whole thing just exists together, that will be, in many ways, your fastest route to being in a spiritual frame of mind and entering into spiritual life. There is a word in Sanskrit that is very rarely used. I actually looked it up in the Monier-Williams dictionary, which is, one of the most commonly used Sanskrit dictionaries. And that word is Sammelana, and it's not even in Monier-Williams. And it's interesting because that alone feels sort of like the inheritance of where it comes from. I learned this word from a teacher named Douglas Brooks. This notion of Sammelana has opened a door for me that was really important. And for that, I will be forever grateful to him. He's studied in South India. I think I've maybe mentioned some of this before. The notion of Sammelana is that there are two contrary and opposite things that exist separately, and that those two things come together to become intertwined, and that once they are combined, they cannot be separated from each other. And yet the two things that combined together can still be distinguished. But as they come together, they create something more than they were before. And the interesting thing about the language is that like the summa, the sum part, the first part of that word, Sammelana, is about bringing together or connecting. So the word is not just as simple as like, okay, I bring these two things together and they combine. It is specifically this notion of like conflict or something different from. So the example that Douglas always used is cafe au lait, which I sort of thought he was doing just for me at the time. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, where a teacher gives an example of something and you go like, oh, he knows something about this. I mean, he's from New York. He lives upstate. Here I am, I'm a good New Orleans girl. And his example is like, you have this bitter, like dark, almost gritty chicory coffee, right? And if you've ever been to New Orleans, you know what this coffee is like. It is not, it's thicker than regular coffee. It has like a density to it. It's almost stingy in its flavor. It's so potent. And then you add in equal parts hot, creamy, foamy, like luscious milk. And those two things mixed together become a cafe au lait. And the cafe au lait is both bitter and sweet, right? Sort of both like has that sharpness, that grittiness almost, and the sweet softness of the milk. It has both things together. And also, when we look at that cafe au lait, we also know that the coffee is still there and the milk is still there, but they've come together to create something else. A third thing that is like almost transcendent, I mean, don't get me wrong, milk is great, coffee with chicory is great, except in my belly. But cafe au lait is just, it's like this perfect magical concoction. So this is the notion of Semolina. And the next example that Douglas would always give, which also really lands in my bones as a yoga teacher, is these three true statements. The first is, you are not your body. And I know that you're not your body and I'm not my body because I can see my body, I can feel my body. If I can have a direct experience of my body, then the I who am experiencing it is not my body. So I have a body, I carry it, it carries me through the world. The relationship is important, but I am not my body. First statement, I am not my body. The second statement, my body is nothing but me. So without me, there is no body, right? There is, if Vera doesn't exist, then Vera's body is no longer here, right? So there's, maybe you might think about that as a hierarchy or as a relationship or that sort of thing. That also feels, right, kind of obvious and true, right? If the body dies, then where am I? Which leads us to the final statement, which is, you and the body are one. You and the body, you are nothing but the body, right? The body is nothing but you. You are nothing other than your body. So that those three statements, they stand true on their own. And the first two blend together to become that third, greater, more extraordinary thing, right? That the ability to experience the world through this embodied state is what allows me to be who I am, what shapes and cultivates my experience. It's what makes, embodiment so extraordinary. And it's why embodiment practices, I think, are so deeply spiritual, whether that's a yoga asana practice or a breathwork practice or, getting out on the dance floor or having sex or going for a run when you get that, in that rhythm. All of those things are so profoundly affirming of existence. So this idea of wait, but all of those two things are not true, but together they must be true. And that might be a little too, this is why I warned you, it's a little heady. Here's the place that I think all of us have actually really experienced this in a way that is beyond words and that is really transcendent, and that's being in love. And whether you have that relationship now or you have memory of that kind of relationship, I just want you to take a minute and think about, have you ever been in love, and what can you touch into that sensation of not just, quote unquote, loving someone or something, but being in love, that there is a hunger that comes from inside you. There's this ache of being with that person, that when you're with them, everything about the world seems extraordinary. Same world, right? Nothing has actually changed, but the feeling that you have for them, and if reciprocated, the feelings you share, just completely change everything, right? Suddenly it's all you can talk about. They're all you can think about. You find yourself obsessing and then trying not to obsess. You're every time you're in a conversation, maybe this is just me, my hyperactive brain going don't talk too much about them. Everybody else is tired and bored of hearing you talking about this person, etc. Right? And you probably had that experience on the other side, right? When somebody that you really care about, a good friend or somebody in your family, meets somebody new, and it's their whole changes, right? Everything, their language changes, and it's their eyes start to shine, right? They have this radiance and this glow, and you probably get tired of hearing about this person that they, that's sort of changed their experience, right? And if you have had that experience, you know how extraordinary it is. And I fear, and also I know, that if you have had that experience, you have also had the experience of real serious heartbreak. Either um, having enough time in relationship with someone for them to really let you down or to betray you, or for you to change or them to change, and for you to lose that same feeling of magic and extraordinariness. Or maybe the relationship ends. And so you have experienced that feeling of heartbreak. And that feeling of real, I'm talking about real devastating, you feel it on an energetic, on a physical level, emotionally. It is the opposite of that elation of the initial falling in love feeling. That heartbreak feeling where suddenly like you lose your appetite. You either can't sleep or only sleep. Like food doesn't have flavor. Everything about the world feels numb and dull. You you have a hard time remembering things, right? It's like all of the complications of grief plus that like added like just devastation of loss. Those two feelings could not be more contrary, right? And yet, when we first, especially after the first time this has happened to you, when you fall in love again, inside of that love, right, living right next to that elation is the knowledge of heartbreak. And the knowledge of heartbreak makes that level of commitment or like immersing yourself in the experience both that much harder and also that much more extraordinary, right? Because we understand the risk that is in it. And the magic of it makes it worthwhile to pursue. And on the other side, in the core of all of that heartbreak, the reason it feels so tender, it's like glass shards on your insides all the time, is because of how extraordinary the love is. And that the love is not gone, actually. That the love and the heartbreak require each other to exist. This is not neat and tidy, like without light there's no darkness. Without good there can be no evil, and vice versa. It is not that. It is love does not exist without heartbreak, and heartbreak does not exist without love. That they're both completely contrary, and they live inside each other at the same time. And you can't have one without the other. And I don't know, maybe the moment after heartbreak when we are willing to fall in love again is actually a profoundly transcendent experience because we understand how immense that experience is. So now that I've taken you on that emotional roller coaster, we can talk about why paradox is important. I hope that example gives you like a visceral understanding of what we're talking about and why it's so activating, and the doors that it starts to open up in us that we are willing to walk through. And I think it's no accident, actually, that the notion of love is so wrapped up in so many spiritual traditions and religious practices, and that heartbreak, that like level of devastation, is actually a doorway for a lot of people into profound spiritual life and practice. So the thing that paradox requires of us is it requires us to bypass or transcend or sidestep our logical minds. And the interesting thing is that that rational mind doesn't go anywhere. Right? It's not like checking out. It actually sticks along for the ride while we go on this spiritual adventure. but it can't drive the bus it can't drive the spiritual train, right? Our rational mind cannot drive the spiritual train. That just doesn't work, right? Because the rational mind says, the things that I can see and feel and experience with my senses are the only things that are real. And you are asking me to believe in something that is not something, right? Spiritual practice says there's something more than, something other than, something bigger, wider, more expansive than. And unless we can find a way to allow the edges of our rational mind to soften a little bit and to be able to be outside of them, not rejecting the logic, but to bring the logic in, right? Like that bitter coffee, or I don't know, maybe the logic is the sweet milk. That we can't have the full experience of really rich spiritual life. That the sharpness of the questions that we're asking ourselves exist because of the logic behind them. Why do bad things happen to good people? That is the most rational, reasonable question. Like, that is, like, what a great question. And it is one of the most spiritual questions we know because there isn't actually a rational answer to that. And so on the other side of that is this open uncertainty. There's Rumi calls it, out beyond the truths of wrongdoings and right doings, there's a field. And that's where we're going. That only in that place, beyond this like binary of good and bad, why bad things happen to good people, can the spirit begin to breathe and to be? And can we have this fuller, more expansive experience of being and of connection? As humans, we really struggle with that. I mean, I don't know, maybe you don't struggle with it. I struggle with it. I want things to be clear. I want them to be black and white, and I want them to make sense. If I do all the right things, if I am a good person and I treat people with kindness and I follow the rules as best I can and participate meaningfully in my community, I want to be rewarded for that with good stuff. You probably do too. Most religious traditions are built on this foundation. And sometimes it's punitive, sometimes it's a carrot and sometimes it's a stick, and it doesn't matter because they're both doing the same things. If you do good stuff, you get good stuff. And I don't know about you, but that's not always been my experience of the world. Sometimes, actually a lot of the times, I do my very best to be, a good, kind, caring person, to participate meaningfully, and I am rewarded, and good stuff happens. And also really terrible, devastating, bad stuff has happened in my life. And I have also made some terrible choices and done some unkind and like really in my life cruel things to other people. And I was not necessarily punished in the way that someone might be punished. So that being in that world says, okay, it's not as simple. It's not as discrete and certain and concrete as would feel safe for me as a logical being. So in order to soften myself up to this notion that the world is not always logical and rational, that there's something bigger than I can imagine there to be, I sort of start with the massage of paradox. That paradox helps me release my grip on the need for things to be so certain and so clear. And if I'm lucky, if we're lucky, it does it in a playful way, right? In like cafe au lait kind of way. So that's the first part of why I think paradox is important. The next part is that the spirit, the universe, God, the great mystery, the great being, grandfathers and ancestors, your spirit guides, whatever words work for us, nature, the infinite spirals, we can't understand it with our rational mind. By design, by definition. By definition, spirit is more than I am, more powerful, more expansive. It has more knowledge than I can fathom. It is more extraordinary and expansive than I can imagine. And so if that is a thing that is true about God, we'll call it for shorthand, then I have to find a way other than my rational mind to make contact. That relating with the divine in a human way, or at least in a logical way, doesn't, it's like it just doesn't work. It's like the book, actually, that Matt Candler and I talked about last time, which is called Flatland. And if you've never read it, it's a super, super simple read, really quick and easy. And in Flatland, it's sort of like the frames of references. I think it was Matt. It might have been Bear. Anyway, there's a point, right? Like a single point. We're talking about geometry now. If that was not your favorite subject, forgive me. So like there's a point and then there's a line, right? And theoretically, a line is an infinite number of points, which means that the point can never understand the line because it is an infinite number of things. And the closer we get along the line, like we can travel great distance along the line and we won't actually be any closer because the line is an infinite length. And the same thing is true for the line to the plane, right? So if we have a, simple sheet of paper here with some notes on it, right? So like there's the line and then the line opens up to a plane, right? To a flat land. And that's sort of quick. The perspective that is possible from one dimension to the second dimension, and if the perspective of the second dimension to the third dimension, that being able to see the dimensionality above that is not feasible. Like not only do you not have the language, you don't have the capacity to understand it. And so when people, wander around talking about the 5D world, like, okay, great, 5D. But I'm like, no, it's like infinite dimension. It is beyond. It is more than we could possibly fathom with our brains. And if you try to understand it, not only will you suffer, you won't get anywhere. You'll just be frustrated. And so what these practices require is for us to get skilled at operating, not abandoning that logical, rational mind, but allowing it to exist, again, side by side with some other way of relating and experiencing the world. And those other ways of relating and experiencing and prayer and meditate, right? Those are our spiritual practices. That is what they are cultivating for us. Something other than rational, logical, human thinking. My great teacher, Krishnadass, says, like, you can't think your way out of a prison that's made of thought, because the thought is the prison. That the Ramana Maharshi, right, tells a similar story. And these are actually also stories about the ego, right? If you ask the ego to engage in spiritual practice, it's like asking the thief to be the policeman. A lot of investigation will be made, but there will be no arrest. That the ego in order for us to have this tremendous spiritual awakening, the ego must be sacrificed. So it will never drive that train in the same way that the logical mind cannot drive the train to the spiritual, right up the spiritual mountain. I don't know what the metaphor we're working with is. And operating outside of that is unsettling. And I just want to acknowledge that. And one of the ways that we get more comfortable with the paradox of living, the paradox of spiritual life and practice, is by doing some of these deep but simple practices. And in this way, like one of my favorite definitions of meditation is the ability to hold two contrary thoughts in the mind at the same time without any friction, right? We just like, I am my body. My body is not me. Right? How can I just be with those in that inherent contradiction and truth at the same time? I probably could go much further down this rabbit hole. We could talk about duality and non-duality, right? We could talk about, the tantric philosophical approach and that so much of that is informing what I'm sharing with you right now. But the place I want to leave you is actually with this. And it is, to me, one of the most important selling points, I guess, of paradox. And that's paradox requires us, it invites us, it demands that we release binaries. That when we talk about things like good and bad, or rich and poor, or suffering and pleasure and pain, fame and gain, all of these, like those are the traditional Buddhist opposites, the pairs of opposites. Anytime you are presented with a binary, the question that we ask ourselves, one of the most useful questions, is who benefits from me choosing between these two binary things? If I need to say that like being rich is good and being poor is bad, who benefits from me choosing? It's usually not me. Asking us to enforce these strict and hard black and white boundaries. They feed a sense of certainty and sometimes safety in us. But that need for safety is often manipulated, I think, inside of systems that cause a tremendous amount of harm. And so this practice of working with paradox and being with paradox and accepting that the world is black and white and gray all at the same time is one of the most essential skills I think that we must develop. It's why, to me, it is one of the core spiritual principles, because it provides for us a scaffolding and a framework to move in a world that is complicated and unfathomable and full of tremendous suffering and extraordinary joy, both on an individual personal level and collectively. That unless we can hold the full capacity, until we can hold the full capacity of absolute devastation and complete bliss, we are not prepared, right? And everything in between and the combination of the two. We're not prepared to move forward in a spiritually connected way in the world that we're living in. As the subtitle of the podcast says, in a world on fire. Reckoning with our desire to be safe and comfortable and at ease and peaceful in a world that is unsafe and not particularly peaceful and pretty scary right now. Learning to be able to hold both of those things at the same time is an essential survival strategy. It is not just part of the way out, but I think the scaffolding, the pathway out. Or maybe it's the pathway in. It says, I can stay here. I can live in the world with all of its complexity, all of its irrationality, and I can find meaning in a world that is chaotic, and that my meaning can't exist without that chaos. And having meaning inside of that chaotic world is transcendent and potentially transcendent and liberatory for every being in it. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for tuning in, Curious Hearts. If this episode was useful, I hope you'll follow the show or leave a review or share it with somebody who you think needs it. And if you're craving support on your own spiritual path or seeking some meaningful work, you can find ways to work with me at veralester.com. Otherwise, until next time, please stay grounded in that curiosity that you've got and keep turning towards what matters. See y'all soon.